Welcome back to the bottom line up front. I'm Matt. We're back from our holiday break.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias.
And I'm Christian, the CEO of Artorias.
And today we're going to be talking about the evolving situation in the Middle East. We're going to specifically focus on the developments going on right now in Yemen and with the Houthis, and try to cover the incoming Trump administration's plans on how they were going to respond to kind of the Houthis' increased aggressive actions, not only in the Red Sea, but the wider Middle East. And one of the interesting situations that we're actually seeing currently during the waning days of the Biden administration is that we've received reports that President Biden looks like has authorized U.S. Central Command to conduct more expansive airstrikes and naval strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, specifically those not only threatening the Red Sea, but also specifically Israel. It's important to note that the Houthis have been a very aggressive actor against Israel, launching ballistic missile strikes across the Jewish state with medium range ballistic missiles, a kind of a capability in the reach that many proxy groups really, the Houthis are the only ones that have that level of capabilities. I mean, we're talking about missiles capable of reaching over 1,000 kilometers, and some of them have even struck inside Israeli territory. Not all the missiles have been intercepted. So this just kind of show a growing capabilities that the Houthi have, and this threat. And Matthew, I kind of would kind of like to start this conversation, kind of focusing a little bit on the capabilities, and then we can kind of broaden it out into this kind of more propaganda and kind of where do the Houthis fit in this kind of weakened axis of resistance. But for you, Matthew, I mean, how do you think the Houthis were able to kind of expand these capabilities? And do you think it was wholeheartedly because of Iranian support, or do you believe that there was kind of this indigenous growth that the Houthis were able to do to kind of expand their capabilities against Israel in the Red Sea?
So personally, I think it's a little column A, column and a little bit of column B. So yes, they are getting support from the Iranians, but at the same time, like they have their own grievances. This is a movement that predates um, the actual date where they took over Sana'a. Um, we have seen a lot of tension between Yemen and the Saudi Arabians, the KSA, for decades. And so this certainly predates the actual time when the United States or the globe started to look into it more closely.
So, what one of the interesting aspects I think when we're talking about the Houthis and we're analyzing it from their point of view and the capabilities is I think you bring up an excellent point, right? If you look at when the Houthis seized Sana'a in the mid 2010s, right, and kind of the post Arab Spring, right, when Yemen kind of was one of the countries that fell and the Houthis kind of clearly became the predominant power. I think it's important to highlight in the beginning, right, of the Houthi movement, they were arch rivals with the previous president of Yemen, the dictator Saleh, right? And once the Arab Spring occurred and protests really started to pick up in Yemen, what we saw was a transition, right? Where Saleh, instead of being the main rival of the Houthis, they reached an agreement, and Saleh was kind of like, in many ways, he thought he was going to be the primary partner or leader, let's say, of Yemen. And slowly but surely, the Houthis started to take more and more and more control, right? The political party of Saleh was the GPC, and the GPC basically became a junior partner. And there was a falling out, a major falling out between the Houthis and the GPC, and the Houthis blatantly took over. They assassinated Saleh and they planted the flag and said, now we are, at least in the northern part, kind of responsible for kind of the Yemen state. They really pushed this rhetoric that the Houthis is the equivalent of Yemen, right? There is oppositions in the south and Aden and kind of this more transitional government that's trying to fight against the Houthis that hasn't really been successful. And even with the support of the GCC led by Saudi Arabia, kind of this Arabic coalition, haven't really been able to dent the Houthis' capabilities. Now, fast forward to October 2023, shortly after kind of the Israeli operations into Gaza, we saw the Houthis expand from this kind of this nationalistic perspective and focus. Now, again, it's important to highlight that the Houthis have a very robust ballistic missile, cruise missile, and drone program that they've leveraged extensively against the GCC. They then started to switch and transfer their focus now to Israel. And they kind of taken this mantra of, again, this kind of this axis of resistance. And the most successful way they've done that, really specifically, is by launching drones and ballistic missiles and even cruise missiles against Israel. And I think people need to understand that when you're analyzing ballistic missiles, when you're looking at cruise missiles, when you're looking at drones, right, the reach of those systems is equivalent to capabilities, right? Most of the times, if you look at the Axis resistance as a whole, let's use Hezbollah as a specific example, right? Hezbollah had a lot of short range capabilities, like short range ballistic missiles, close range ballistic missiles, rockets, drones, etc. It mostly focused, or you can even argue, wholeheartedly focused against Israel. But the Hezbollah never had a ballistic missile capable of traveling over 1,000 kilometers. That just wasn't in their kind of in their arsenal. But you see the Houthis within the last 10 years, when they really kind of seized control of Yemen, at least the northern part, and became a predominant power there, you saw their capabilities slowly but surely increase. And Saudi Arabia being the first country to suffer it more significantly, that really caused a lot of problems. And now the Israelis are dealing with this. Now, obviously, Israel has better capabilities. It's a smaller country. It's kind of, at least from an air defense perspective, easier for the Israelis to handle. But the Houthis have been this constant thorn for Israel. And if you look at it from the U.S. point of view, right? I mean, the Houthis' anti-ship ballistic missile program is fairly robust. Something that, again, in the last 5 years, they really haven't had. And so I think, you know, clearly the Houthis have received support from Iran. That's an undisputable fact. But I think we can't just analyze this from an Iran shipping capabilities directly to the Houthis, basically shipping an end product to the Houthis. What it There has to be, and we're seeing it with kind of the strikes that CENTCOM has done. What the CENTCOM has announced is, and fairly consistent with the air campaign that they've done, is targeting actual production facilities, indicating that the Iranians have basically have a very robust program of train the trainer and given them the capabilities to do that. And I think we're seeing that live currently right now in the Houthis' Red Sea strikes and Israeli strikes.
So I think Saudi Arabia, in this case, bit off more than they could actually chew. So we can look back to King Abdullah, who was saying, keep Yemen weak, but not too weak. And that advice isn't really helpful because how do you actually gauge that? And at some point, the Houthis were able to actually take advantage of the fact that the Saudi Arabians had made the government too weak. And we this came at the same time, if we look at Aden or al-Mukalla, that ISIS was making advances. And with the United States' help, they were actually able to push back Al Qaeda and ISIS in al-Mukalla, but the Saudis were not strong enough to actually hold on to any sort of power structure within Yemen. And that is when you saw the Houthis really take over. Um, and so it was this strategy that is born out of a long history of conflict between the Saudis and Yemen that had previously culminated in 1934 with the war that took place, and the Yemenis had actually lost control over several territories that are now occupied by the Saudis in the southwest of the country. And there's been this long striving goal for the Saudis to maintain that. Um, but they haven't really paid attention to internal politics within Yemen. And I think that has been a huge part of why we see such a strong resistance in Yemen.
So do you think, Matthew, then that now, so with the Houthis, I think we're in agreement that today the Houthis are now the dominant, not the only, but the dominant political force in Yemen. And so the question is, with Israel conducting strikes in Yemen, with the United States, United Kingdom conducting strikes in Yemen against the Houthis, where do you think Saudi Arabia, specific MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, where do you think the Saudi policy is this year and kind of the 2025, 2026, and maybe even 2027? What do you think Saudi's policy is going to be related to Yemen? Is it going to be a policy of we don't want to kind of re-engage in this quagmire? In other words, kind of keep it at arm's length, not get involved directly into that fight? Do you think the Saudis would be more active and kind of a repeat of a counter Houthi campaigns? Where do you see the Saudis kind of fitting in this US, UK, and in a separate aspect, the Israeli campaign against the Houthis?
Honestly, I think they're going to do their own thing. I think they are overly focused on Sana'a. Um, and it wouldn't surprise me if Aden became a target. But if you look out to the east of the country in places like Al Mukalla, which I mentioned before, they really don't seem to have a focus there. And that makes me worried in terms of extremist groups that might be able to take advantage of, the lack of their presence or the lack of presence of the United States.
As we're seeing kind of this, or pivoting on that, do you think that the ISIS threat and the Al Qaeda threat in Yemen and kind of this degradation of security that is going on because of these external actors playing an active role in Yemen, do you think that this will enable kind of a resurgence of ISIS and Al Qaeda in Yemen? Because I think it's important to highlight, Al Qaeda in Yemen was one of the most powerful franchise and kind of the Al Qaeda global uh, terrorist organization. The Yemen franchise was probably one of the most predominant and active groups, specifically focusing on external operations, right? And trying to conduct successful attacks against the United States. Do you see a situation where if the Houthis become the primary focus for the United States, UK, Israel, maybe even Saudi Arabia, that we might see a resurgence of ISIS in Yemen and Al Qaeda in Yemen?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. Again, I think if you look to the eastern portion of that country, there it's fairly lawless. But my bigger concern, and this is something that I've brought up quite a bit in this podcast, but uh, I would look to the Sahel. I think we are creating a situation where they're going to have the same sort of autonomy that they found in Afghanistan. So we're in a very tricky situation here where you have a lot of these offshoots. And if they actually want to focus on, what they call the far enemy, which would be the United States, um, they have the room to do that. So it's something that we should be paying much more attention to.
And I think the recent terrorist attack in New Orleans does indicate kind of even for those who just wish to aspire to join ISIS and conduct attacks. Unfortunately, the terrorist attack in New Orleans kind of demonstrate that this kind of resurgent threat is still there, even with kind of the physical destruction of the caliphate, specifically in ISIS. These groups are able to kind of still pose a threat to the United States, the West, and to the wider world. But kind of going back to Yemen and specifically the Houthis, in the last ever since the United States started to initiate campaign strikes against the Houthis, me personally, I haven't really seen a degradation of combat power from the Houthis specifically. Like we continue to see ballistic missile launches against Israel. Even though, like, if you look clearly, let's say at Hamas and Hezbollah, right, those specific two proxy groups within the axis of resistance, there you can clearly see a degradation of combat power that is, you know, measurable and easily to prove. But with the campaign strikes that we've seen against the Houthis, led by the United States and the UK, and even a little bit by Israel, we haven't seen really a degradation, right? We haven't seen a decrease really, and that much against the Red Sea, against merchant vessels transiting the Red Sea. The Houthis claim that they're targeting vessels that are heading to Israel or supported by Israel, and that's demonstrably false. We've seen vessels that have been attacked that had no relationship whatsoever to Israel or to the West in general. But we haven't seen a lack or a drop really in that threat. And we continue to see strikes from the Houthis against Israel. And so that to me personally shows that the Houthis continue to have a very robust, ballistic missile program in place that is not wholeheartedly dependent on Iran. And so if the plan, let's say the incoming Trump administration, right, is to try to choke off the Houthis, maybe increase naval interdictions, which CENTCOM and Fifth Fleet specifically have been very active in. I don't see that necessarily degrading the Houthis. And so the question is, what can be done differently if the goal of the incoming Trump administration is to really weaken the Houthis? And it looks like that is kind of the course that in the waning days of the Biden administration, what they're trying to do. What tactics and measures can the United States do really to try to weaken the Houthis, ballistic missile program so it doesn't threaten the Red Sea and it doesn't threaten Israel?
Well, I think the biggest thing is we can take them seriously. I already mentioned some of the counter Al-Qaeda operations that were happening around Al-Maqala, which, if you look at the map, is much further to the east. Um, but I haven't seen anything serious targeting the Houthis themselves. It's become pretty clear that Saudi Arabia is not up to the task, and it would require the United States to start taking out more serious infrastructure. Um, and to this point, for the most part, we've seen them taking out, radio stations, radar stations, nothing significant, at least to date.
So do you think then we might have to kind of have a repeat in a way of Operation Inherent Resolve in Iraq and Syria, where it's almost like persistent, ISR coverage? Because again, I mean, one of the differences, obviously, that the Houthis have, even comparative to Hezbollah, is, I mean, the Houthis do have a fairly robust air defense system. Now, obviously, it's not comparable to nation states, but the Houthis have been successful at shooting down U.S. drones over the Red Sea and over Yemen, much more so than any other non-state actor there. I mean, again, it kind of reinforces this idea that almost as the Houthis, we might have to start referring them to a non-state actor, and at least from a military capabilities point of view, a lot of things that they're doing kind of reaches to the level of nation states, and even more so than most nation states out there, right? The ballistic missile programs, their air defense capabilities. And so is the solution, or is the plan, as you said, to take them more seriously? Does that then translate into a kind of like OIR-esque named operation specifically focused in Yemen and the Houthis specifically?
I think it has to be, honestly. And if we look at proximity to Camp Lemonade and Djibouti, it's kind of surprising that they haven't taken this more seriously sooner.
Zooming out a little bit, if we want to, because we've had episodes in previous podcasts where we're talking about kind of the axis as a resistance as a whole, right? We see clearly, prior to October 7th, 2023, I think if we all had a conversation, we were all were willing to say, who is the primary proxy force that Iran has within the axis of resistance. I think we would all universally agreed it's Hezbollah, right?
Yeah,
Now, though,
100%. Yeah.
yeah, but now, though, with kind of, I think it's undisputable that Hezbollah has taken a severe beating by Israel's campaign in Lebanon, at least capability wise, I think it's pretty clear that it's the Houthis. So now the question becomes if we're in agreement in the capability aspect, now, and at least in the propaganda and the rhetoric point of view, we do see the Houthis almost trying to take over that mantle of the axis of resistance, at least the leadership aspect, right? And try to frame themselves as the new leader of the axis of the resistance. And so are we going to see, because where I'm analyzing this is the Houthis are, although allied with Iran, they're not as beholden to Iran. I think it's important to highlight, the Houthis, yes, are very ideologically driven. Their ideology is a very important aspect of their political movement and their goals, but they have had a history of not necessarily toeing the line 100% with Iran. And they've kind of shown this a much more streak of independence, at least from a nationalistic point of view, much more so than Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, as a political party of Lebanon, obviously had their own domestic considerations and constraints. The Houthis were much more than that. But I think October 7th kind of changed that. And now that we're seeing Hezbollah and Hamas severely weaken, do we see the Houthis replace Hezbollah? And 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 also, do we believe that is the Houthis' objectives? Is to become the now primary proxy force within the axis of resistance, replacing Hezbollah that prior to October 7th clearly had that role?
Um, I don't think so. I think they have their own grievances. They want to continue to get aid from Iran, but at the same time, they have their own goals, and I don't think they should be seen as the same type of proxy that, we view Hezbollah or even Hamas as, even though Hamas is Sunni and not Shia. Uh, this has a very long history. It goes back to uh, the war between Saudi Arabia and Yemen in 1934, uh, where Yemen lost four territories, four provinces in the southwest of Saudi Arabia. So there's this long history there, and there's also a lot of different reasons why people are picking up arms that don't have to be directly tied to Islam or, your typical sort of grievances. So yeah, I think we'll continue to see them try and get as much aid as possible from Iran, but I wouldn't view them as the proxy in the same way that, we viewed Hamas or especially Hezbollah or some of the groups in Iraq and Syria.
I think the primary one that comes to mind when we're talking about Iraq would be Kataib Hezbollah. I think that's the kind of and then there's obviously a lot more AAH, the Badr organization, but Kataib Hezbollah clearly is probably the primary one in Iraq. And so, Matthew, I'd like your direct opinion. Then, what do you believe is the Houthis' overall objectives? And if they're kind of more nationalistic and more personal grievance, how do we tie that then with the actions they've been doing in the Red Sea and against Israel?
Well, I think that's very tough. And I wouldn't pretend to know what the end game is. I think they're trying to disrupt any sort of conversation um, between the GCC and the United States. Um, but it doesn't fully make sense to me why they're attacking shipping lanes, because that's a very good way to get more powerful countries involved, and cause a lot of headaches for the regime.
Do you think that the Houthis view the Abraham Accords as a threat to their own national security interests? In other words, an Israel rapprochement and opening relations with the GCC. I mean, obviously the UAE having open diplomatic relations. A lot of the conversations prior to October 7th, 2023 was this Saudi normalization with Israel. Do you think that the Houthis view a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia as kind of a national security threat for the Houthis?
Well, it by their actions, it certainly seems that way. But at the same time, I would have thought that they would have been more open to it because um, a calmer Middle East would behoove everyone. So yeah, I'm a little bit surprised by seeing that they're still as bellicose as they were before. And I'd be curious on your thoughts or Christian.
Well, what I would say is I do believe that the Houthis, based on their rhetoric, based on their actions, I think October 7th, 2023, because again, the Houthis have always had this ideological underpinning. I do agree that they also, this kind of this nationalistic approach to Yemen and how the Houthis view it, that from a kind of this nationalistic point of view is very important. But I do believe there was a fundamental shift within the Houthi movement because of October 7th and Israel's military operations, not only into Gaza, but into Lebanon. And I think the Houthis saw this as a prime opportunity to become the leader of the Axis of Resistance, or at least publicly try to claim that role. And right now, capability wise, they are the leader of the Axis of Resistance. There is no other organization, no other non state actor, no other militia group, terrorist organization within the Middle East that has the capabilities that the Houthis have. And again, I go back to kind of this original point where the Houthis and their military operations is equivalent to what we would see state actors do. And so is this an attempt, kind of because Matthew, the points you're bringing up kind of makes me think right now during this podcast is this kind of an expansion of the Houthi ideology as a notion of a nation state, right? In other words, where the Houthis are now trying to claim, kind of the Palestinian issue as a rallying cry for their own citizens in the territory they control, to kind of expand the scope and the reach and the support that they might receive within Yemen, right? Because the historical grievance with Saudi Arabia, although important, you know, Saudi Arabia still had a lot of influence, even during the Yemeni civil war, within the transitional government. And then we saw the UAE specifically attempt to leverage Southern separatist organizations under the STC, try to expand their influence. And you started to see, the Saudis, UAE, Iran, all these foreign powers leverage the situation in Yemen for their own national security and geopolitical interests, right? Specifically, the UAE is a perfect example of that. And I think October 7th enabled the Houthis to try to, at least in a propaganda and an ideological sense, to reclaim the mantra of a Yemenese state and ideology, really focusing in specifically on the Palestinian issue, which directly kind of ties into the overarching aspects of the axis of resistance. And so, although the Houthis, if you kind of look at the rhetoric, it's always, you don't really necessarily see them that much using kind of a lot of the terminologies that other terrorist organizations and militia groups that support Iran use in the Levant and in Mesopotamia. But what they do focus a lot on is the Palestinian issue. And a lot of the capabilities that they do is specifically geared towards that. And so I think the Houthis are trying to find this way of rallying the nation, rallying Yemen for a common cause that is no longer beholden to other actors. Because now the Houthis can look at Saudi Arabia and say, you have done nothing for the Palestinians. We have, and in a way, they gain more legitimacy within the Arab world, at least the Houthis probably think, outside of Yemen with this cause. And I think there's also an understanding within the Houthis that the risk is, I think there's a lot of countries are a little bit hesitant of getting too deeply involved in Yemen. So if you look at the US, the UK, and Saudi Arabia, clearly they're not going to commit as of yet the capabilities necessary to really degrade Houthis' military capabilities. The one country that probably would have at least an intent to do that is Israel. But the problem now is Israelis' reach and capabilities. Yes, Israel can conduct strikes into Yemen, but they can't do it like they did in Gaza or in Lebanon to really degrade the Houthis' military capabilities. So I think the Houthis are saying, yes, we can take some hurt, but the legitimacy we gain because of our support to Hamas outweighs those risks.
Yeah, I honestly I think that's very astute. Um, I think the Houthis are far less concerned with some of these historical claims that sort of led the movement, especially in the early days. Um, and they're more interested in solidifying their power uh, in the West. And when I say the West, I mean the west of Yemen, um, and making sure that they have as strong a foothold as possible. And they can do that by, showing limited support for the Palestinians. So I do think that's what you're saying right now.
So now tying this into the incoming Trump administration, and we can kind of zoom out a little bit because the Houthis, if you're kind of analyzing the Middle East as a whole, is a piece of the puzzle, right? But there's a larger role in play. And even as the recording of this episode, it was kind of interesting. We saw this increased rhetoric, from Iranian state TV, specifically IRIB. They kind of made this cryptic post and message indicating that within the quote the next couple of hours there was going to be like earth-shattering news and developments that would kind of change the dynamics of the region. And I think I personally believe that that's propaganda. Time will tell. But we've seen this increased rhetoric from the Iranians recently indicating that they are going to respond to the latest, the October strike that Israel conducted inside of Iran, that Iran was going to respond to that. And we're seeing kind of this, at least from a propaganda point of view and a rhetorical point of view, rhetoric point of view, an increase in threat across the Middle East. And so with the Trump administration coming in, you know, I believe it was the Wall Street Journal reported that, the Trump administration is no longer going to be comfortable with just the maximum pressure campaign. That the Trump administration doesn't believe that a maximum pressure campaign will be enough to degrade Iran, specifically their nuclear program and their nuclear weapons program. And there's actual serious conversations going on right now of the United States and or with Israel conducting direct strikes into Iran. So kind of zooming out, looking at the Middle East as a whole, and maybe Iran a little bit more specifically, I think it's interesting and important to highlight, where do we see 2025? Where do we see the Trump administration going on related to the Middle East and with Iran specifically? Because the people that they've selected, that the Trump administration has selected, do have a very Iran hawkish view. And I think this idea of any attempts of negotiations seems pretty much dead immediately when Trump comes into office.
I mean, they definitely have a hawkish view, and that's putting it lightly. I don't think they have the understanding to actually have these conversations. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but Marco Rubio might be the best person in that cabinet to actually have some of these conversations. And I think, we're definitely going to be on the back foot here.
But Matthew, do you believe? Because from what I'm seeing, I think it's pretty clear that a military, much more so than the first Trump administration, U.S. military strikes against Iran is a very serious, not only possibility, but I dare to say almost a likely outcome unless there's a major breakthrough. And Iran basically folds in a lot of the issues that they've held so dear previously. I do see Trump and the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu attempting to do strikes even at the nuclear weapons program that Iran, is developing. I do believe strikes in Iran is a likely outcome for 2025.
I mean, I definitely think that's true. But I don't think the administration, as I've seen um, previously, is thinking about second order or tertiary effects of those strikes and what comes next. It's very, very much, that 10-meter target, and then what comes after, it seems like they'll just play it by ear, and that's pretty scary.
I think we've all been focused on the pivot to the Indo-Pacific, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was this idea that the United States was trying to pull out of the Middle East, but every time the US tries to do that, it somehow finds a way to manage to get sucked in. And I think the Biden administration tried to manage the crisis in the Middle East in a way where, unlike the Houthis, where I think the Biden administration was kind of forced to get involved, they didn't do it to an extent that really would dent the Houthis' capabilities. I think that policy is done. I do believe we're going to have a lot more hawkish approach. I mean, Trump has now made it in multiple press conferences and multiple interviews, has basically told Hamas directly, if you do not release the hostages by January 20th, when he's inaugurated as president, basically all hell will break loose. And I do believe that in 2025, an expansion where that's always been the conversation, right? Does Israel, Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, do we see an expansion of that war to the entirety of the Middle East? I do believe that at least what we're seeing right now, what's being reported publicly, that is a very likely outcome. And so, to your point, kind of the second and third order effects of that, the question then becomes what would be Iran's response? And does Iran take an approach of what I think we've all kind of been a little bit surprised about is this? Yes, Iran has conducted strikes against Israel, but Iran didn't come to save Hezbollah. They didn't go in to try to save Hamas. They didn't even try to save Bashar al-Assad, the key leader that I think was basically the bridge for the axis of resistance. I mean, it's very hard, almost if not impossible, to resupply Hezbollah without Syria. And Iran needed Bashar al-Assad to do that. And when Bashar al-Assad lost Aleppo, Hama, and Homs, Iran did nothing to save him from losing Damascus. So now Bashar al-Assad is gone. And so right now, I think it's an undisputable fact that Iran is probably one of its weakest points it's been in the last 20 years. And I think this is a situation where the Trump administration sees blood in the water and in coordination possibly even with Benjamin Netanyahu are going to take a much more aggressive approach against Iran. And I don't see the Iranians really doing anything to mitigate or prepare for that. And I don't see the Islamic Republic really attempting to reestablish deterrence. And Iran is in a very weakened position, not only geopolitically, you can even argue militarily because of the loss of their key proxy forces in the Middle East, but also economically. And I just don't see anything the Iranians are doing to really prepare for this. And I'm almost thinking that the Iranians are hoping that although yes, there was a maximum pressure campaign during the first Trump administration, I think the Iranians viewed that as we managed to survive that, we can survive this one. And I don't believe they understand that this might be significantly different, where there's going to be a serious attempt to significantly weaken the Islamic Republic. And if the Iranians don't reestablish deterrence or don't do anything, they're basically opening that door to a much more aggressive U.S. policy in the Middle East.
Well, this is where I would hope to see a little bit more tact because this is the perfect opportunity. Um, but Sun Tzu outlines when you have a enemy cornered, build them a golden bridge to retreat across. Um, and that's what I'm worried about because if we don't give them options, if it's just, full board, take them out, regime change, that is when we're going to see them backed into a corner. And what does that actually mean? Because, everything I've seen says they're, a few weeks to a month away from actually being able to produce a nuclear weapon. And that's very concerning.
I do believe actually the latest report even indicated that they might be only a couple of days, that the Iranians have managed to advance their.
Well, I didn't want to overshoot it, but yeah.
Yeah, I did see that, and again, I think, and then I think that is probably the focus of the Trump administration is I think they don't want, and let's be honest, I think not even the Trump administration, but I even would say the Biden administration, and almost kind of one of the very few areas of bipartisan support in the United States is ensuring that Iran does not achieve nuclear weapons, right?
But I'm not seeing people, being nominated for important positions who have the know-how to take this seriously and apply that pressure.
I think the Trump administration views it that the military option is the only option unless the Iranians fold completely. And I
But
think the
but you
argument,
could you
yeah,
can look at Stuxnet and how effective that was. Um, and obviously that started under Bush and continued under Obama. Um, that type of action would be our best option.
I think the problem that we're running into from a nuclear weapons and proliferation point of view is that you, the United States has, you can delay, but the Iranians have continued to expand their nuclear enrichment. And in many cases, the argument from the United States would be that the Iranians, although publicly are committed to, let's say, negotiations and the JCPOA, and look, the Biden administration tried to get a JCPOA 2.0 because the Trump administration pulled out. The Biden administration tried to renegotiate that. They had 4 years, and what the Iranians were saying, we're not going to renegotiate the JCPOA. You have to recommit to it, right?
The only time Trump pulled out.
And so what I would say is that when you're analyzing that and you're looking at that, what you've actually seen is the Iranians being able to more and more, although maybe not as quickly as before, but continue to reach a point where the capabilities of them to develop a nuclear weapon now is only determined on a decision, not in a capability. So historically in the past, there could have been an argument, well, Iran made the decision to build a nuclear weapon, so they have X amount of months, even historically in the past, it would have been X amount of years and maybe even X amount of months. Now, all the latest reporting we're getting, it's, now we're saying at best weeks and even to the point of days from a decision when if the Iranians make the decision to develop a nuclear weapon, they basically already have that capability. Now, granted, it's the development of a nuclear weapon. We're not talking about miniaturization, putting it into a ballistic missile, et cetera, but at least the capabilities of building a nuclear weapon is now really beholden to the supreme leader. So the moment the supreme leader says, we're building a nuclear weapon, in almost no time, they have that capability. And I think that what the United States, and again, this kind of transcends the political aspect of the situation, is that the United States, I think, is not going to tolerate that situation. I mean, there was even some reporting, unconfirmed, I would say, that even the Biden administration was actually having those conversations of conducting military strikes against the Iranian nuclear program because of that concern. And I think the United States does not want a repeat of North Korea, where there's this belief that the North Koreans, we could negotiate our way, we can kind of deter our way and preventing them from having nuclear weapons. And now we're in a situation where the North Koreans have a fairly significant nuclear weapons program to the point that you can maybe even argue that they have the capabilities of launching an intercontinental ballistic missile or interrange ballistic missiles to the US homeland with a nuclear weapon. And I think the United States saying we cannot tolerate that situation in the Middle East. We cannot tolerate a situation where now the Saudis feel they have to build a nuclear weapon, where the UAE feels they have to build a nuclear weapon, where the Egyptians, etc. And I think that is why the United States might be going into 2025 at one of the probably closest points of war with Iran in the last decade because of, and you can look at it both sides, you can blame the Iranians, you can blame the United States, but there's never been a clear commitment to ensure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon. And the United States has made it abundantly clear, both in the Obama administration, Trump, Biden, and now a repeat of the Trump administration, is we are not going to enable or allow Iran to build a nuclear weapon. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Well, and one of the biggest fears I have would be the fact that Russia has already demonstrated their use of a reentry vehicle in Ukraine. And that could be something that obviously the North Koreans would be very interested in, and also something that they could provide to Iran. And that is something we should all be worried about.
I think 2025, if we looked in the past couple of years where the United States, during the Biden administration, the pull out of Afghanistan, prior to October 7th, the Middle East was kind of, there was a point, I think, in U.S. foreign policy circles where the Middle East was no longer going to be kind of the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy, national security. Yes, there were still going to be counterterrorism operations. Yes, there's still a counter-ISIS campaign. But there was a hope and a belief that the United States was going to focus again on peer competitors, Russia, and China. October 7th, I think, somewhat shattered that, but not completely. But the incoming Trump administration, I think, has clearly stated that the Middle East will again be, if not the primary focus of the United States, because I think you still have the China component. I think we're going to run into a situation where Iran, at a minimum, is the second, if not the first, primary focus of the United States. And the United States is going to be seen as recommitting its diplomatic and military and economic focus into the Middle East again.
Yeah, I honestly I would tend to agree. I think this is probably a good place to call the podcast, but um, last thoughts from you, Stefano or Christian?
I think this is going to become a recurring series of ours. I mean, if you kind of ironically looked at our podcast, right? We talked about a lot of topics, and then when we talked with in the beginning because of Israel, Lebanon, Gaza, etc., and then we try to pivot and focus on providing updates in Russia, Ukraine, and all these other topics. And then the Syria situation happened so quickly, where we had multiple episodes, even an emergency podcast, and even an emergency Twitter space talking about the latest developments in Syria. And I think what's always happens in the Middle East is you can always try to pivot away from it, but somehow it always manages to suck back your attention. And I think now 2025 though is nobody's going to want to be caught by surprise anymore. And that's why the Middle East will become a primary focus, not only with Iran, but the terrorist attacks in New Orleans demonstrate that there's still this, ISIS threat. We're seeing a possibility of a resurgence of Al Qaeda. The situation of Afghanistan continues to deteriorate. And so I think the United States acknowledges that we're going to focus a lot on the Middle East with a primary focus probably on Iran, and then a second focus probably on ISIS and Al Qaeda. So this is probably going to be one of many episodes that we're going to have this year focusing on the Middle East. And I think it's very apt and correct that our first episode of 2025 focuses on this region.
Well, and I think we definitely need to have a conversation around that terrorist attack and sort of what that means, big picture. But when it comes to the Middle East, to quote Salvador from The Sopranos, just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in. Like it, I think you're dead on. This is something that is, we've been focused on it for several decades at this point, and we just can't escape it. So, yeah, the conversation there will continue, and hopefully, we can provide some insight as to how to improve the situation. But thank you all for listening. Thank you so much, Stefano and Christian, and we will see you fairly soon, probably next week. So. This has been the bottom line up front. Thank you so much for joining us.